Bret Stephens. Bret is one of today's top journalists and a sought-after political commentator, seen almost daily on CNN, Fox News, and numerous radio and television outlets worldwide. Bret writes the Journal's Global View column on foreign affairs. It runs every Tuesday in the US. It's also published in the European and the Asian editions of the paper. He's the editorial page editor, the columnist on foreign affairs, and the Far Eastern Economic Review. He doesn't have a lot of spare time. We are very lucky to get him here this evening. From 2002 to 2004, Mr. Stephens was editor-in-chief for the Jerusalem Post, a position he assumed at just 28 years old. Mr. Stephens was named a young global leader by the World Economic Forum, where he is also a media fellow. Raised in Mexico City and educated at the University of Chicago and the London School of Economics, Mr. Stephens is married and has 3 children and lives in New York City. He has a sharp tongue and, lucky for us, a Zionist soul. Please help me welcome Bret Stephens.
Marcus, thank you for the lovely introduction. Audrey, Roz, the whole board and community of Stand With Us, I'm very happy to be here. I know Douglas through his work, and he's this really extraordinary guy, so I'm not sure that I'm going to be an adequate replacement for him. On the other hand, I have one advantage over Douglas, which is that I already snuck in across the Mexican border many years ago. So, damas y caballeros, es un gran placer estar aquí en San Diego. I'm going to talk about Iran. And this is a subject that obviously has been very much in the news. I'm sure every single one of you in this room is aware of what has been happening between Jerusalem and Washington, the tension, comments by General Martin Dempsey about not wanting to be, quote, complicit in any Israeli attack, the expectations for Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit to New York for the General Assembly of the UN in a couple weeks' time, the meeting with President Obama. This is grim stuff. And so, because I'm going to spend the next 20 or minutes, half an hour in sort of unrelieved, depressing territory, I wanted to begin by telling you a very dirty joke. For all the rabbis in this room, I heard this from Rabbi Lau himself, so it's been cleared. But you'll appreciate that it's actually not just a diversion, it's apropos of what I'm talking about. So Goldstein goes to his doctor. The doctor says, "Mr. Goldstein, the results of your tests are in, and I'm afraid I have terrible news. The cancer is just much more advanced than we had previously imagined, and I don't think you're going to live through the night." You can imagine how Goldstein receives this. Anyway, he goes home, tells his wife of 30 years. Wife bursts into tears. I mean, this is not easy news. I mean, the man is going to be dead by morning. But after a while, they settle down, they talk about their life together, they talk about their children, they talk about their business, they review their will, and the hours go on late into the night. Eventually, they're tired and they go to bed. Goldstein is lying there, staring at the ceiling, pokes his wife in the ribs. She says, "Of course." I heard this joke from Rabbi Lau, so it contains an element of censorship. Half an hour later or so, he's lying in bed. looking up at the ceiling, pokes his wife in the ribs again. She says, "Of course." Half an hour later, he's lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, pokes his wife again. She looks at him and says, "Hey, buddy, you don't have to wake up in the morning." Now, it's a kosher joke. I tell that mindful of the debate that's now taking place between Jerusalem and Washington, an administration that understands that whatever happens, the United States will have to wake up in the morning to deal with the sinking U.S. economy, the challenge of the Chinese, jobless reports, and so on, against an Israel that, for all the challenges, and they are serious, of the misnamed Arab Spring, of its own regional economy of the Palestinians, an Israel that really faces just one great, insuperable, not insuperable, but potentially insuperable, mortal threat, and that is the threat of Iran. And I was thinking about how we need to be looking at what this threat means. And I'd like to organize your thoughts into a few categories. They're moral categories. One is self-deception, one is deception, one is clarity, one is friendship, and one is courage. Now, when we talk about deception, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which last I looked was not run by Richard Perle, Paul Wolfowitz, or any other suspected Jewish neoconservatives, had issued its latest report on the progress of Iran's nuclear weapons. One of the things that they find is that Iran has now enriched 200 kilograms of uranium to a 20% level. Now, what does that mean? What does enrichment to 20% mean? It means that Iran has gotten 87% of the way towards having sufficiently enriched bomb-grade material. They are that close. How much uranium enriched to 20% do you need for one bomb? You need about 250 kilos. They've been enriching 200 kilos in the space of a year, according to the IAEA. They are months away. What we also learned from the IAEA is, contrary to what you might have heard from our own U.S. intelligence sources, that famous National Intelligence Estimate from 2007, is that the Iranians never abandoned their weaponization work. There was always a program. And you can see it not only in the report, but in satellite photographs, where you note how the Iranians are literally scooping up dirt from sites they fear may someday be inspected, at Lavazan, Parchin nuclear facility, because they know that they have been conducting tests for the purposes of miniaturizing a nuclear weapon and fitting it on top of a ballistic missile. This deception began in 2002 when an Iranian opposition group outed the facilities at Natanz, at Isfahan, in Iraq. And as Audrey once said about the 1930s, he wrote a poem, September 1st, 1939. He talked about a low, dishonest decade. And from Iran, we've had a low, dishonest decade. Now that is deceit, but there's another side to deceit, self-deceit. For the past decade, we have been telling ourselves a succession of stories about why the threat from Iran is not an especially serious one. We told ourselves, first of all, that this threat was hype from the Bush administration, that the former president was trying to, quote, lie us into another Middle Eastern war, that the intelligence was uncertain. We were told then that we could persuade the Iranians to enter in what we called a grand bargain, in which we would offer them spare parts for their planes, commercial relations, full diplomatic normalization, a U.S. embassy in Tehran. They loved the last one. Why not send in another? And for all of these goods, they would abandon their nuclear program. And I have to say that the Bush administration and then the Obama administration pursued that view in good faith for years, most recently in talks in Baghdad and Moscow and Istanbul. And yet what we learned is that the Iranians were not, to our surprise, interested in any kind of grand bargain with the West. We imagined that if we were really clever, we could conduct a highly sophisticated campaign of cyber warfare in order to use malware, bugs, worms, and computers to do the kind of damage against Iran's nuclear facilities that we were reluctant to do through more kinetic means, by bombing them, attacking them. And so all of you are aware of the Stuxnet virus, of the Duku virus, of other efforts to penetrate Iran's systems. And yet what we learned from the UN watchdogs is that Iran's program has not been slowed by these covert activities. Iran's programs have accelerated. So we have been, for the past decade, telling ourselves a succession of fantasies that either the Iranian program is not aiming towards a nuclear bomb. Even now, the administration says that we can't know for a certainty that a bomb is what they want. Or we've been telling ourselves that there are means, short of war, to keep that from happening. I might add, we pursued a policy of sanctions against the Iranians. But the Iranians are unbound by sanctions. And ask yourself, do you think that a regime that was willing to send children into minefields during the Iran-Iraq war is really going to be stopped because the price of diapers has risen in the streets of Tehran, because they're upset that inflation is running a little higher than usual? We are deceiving ourselves if we imagine that a sanctions program is going to be able to stop Iran's nuclear ambition. Now, the third point I mentioned, and I think this comes in two parts, is clarity. One is strategic clarity, and one is moral clarity. What do I mean by strategic clarity? There is this highly elaborated, sophisticated school of thought at places like the Council on Foreign Relations and other kind of emblems of the American foreign policy establishment that are telling us that we, in fact, can live with a nuclear Iran. Yes, a nuclear Iran would be unfortunate, but after all, North Korea has nuclear weapons. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. China under Mao Zedong had nuclear weapons, Russia under Joseph Stalin. And yet here we are, all these years later, still kicking. Why not an Iran with nuclear weapons? And so this view that we can contain Iran has become a very powerful and very insidious view. It's insidious because we tell ourselves that ultimately we aren't really prepared to go that far to stop the Iranians. And we don't just tell ourselves, we tell the Iranians too. They know it. They sense our weakness. Despots are bad at many, many things, but one thing they are masters at is studying and smelling human weakness. And the leaders in Tehran are the most accomplished leaders in this kind of, this form of statesmanship. So we've been talking about containment. We've been talking about dealing with a nuclear Iran. We've been talking more often than not in recent days, not about containing Iran, but about containing Israel. In fact, you might say that the entire strategy of the West today isn't to contain Iran, it's how to contain Israel. It's how to keep those crazy warmongers in Jerusalem, or from their point of view, in Tel Aviv, from launching a preemptive strike. We have been saying, furthermore, that the United States does not want a third Middle Eastern war. But the whole point of stopping Iran isn't about a third Middle Eastern war, it's about a third world war, which is what we are trying to prevent. We need more clarity. We need to understand what the Iranian regime is all about, what it's all about for the United States, and what it's all about for Israel. If Iran becomes a nuclear power, we will quickly find that our exit from the Middle East, not just Iraq, not just Afghanistan, is going to become a route from the entire Persian Gulf. Is that really what we want to see in the next 5 or 10 years? For us to get kicked out the way the British were in the 1940s and 50s? We need to think about that. We also need to think about what it means for Israel if Iran acquires nuclear weapons. You know, I remember after in 2005, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad made this comment, wipe Israel off the map. And the instantaneous reaction by the geniuses in my profession, by the way, when you wonder why the media is so mediocre, it's because it attracts morons, but I'll get to that subject later on. Not universally to any of you who might be in the press, present company excluded. So he said this, and people said, oh, no, 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 he didn't mean wipe Israel off the map. He sort of was offering a wish that at some point in the distant future, Zionism would give way to some other kind of political form. So it was sort of like imagining that, you know, the Texan Republic or something would one day become part of the United States and just be a historical figment. Really? This is what the Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, had to say about Israel in February. He said, Israel is a cancerous tumor that should be cut and will be cut. This is what the Chief of Staff of the Iranian Armed Forces said in May. The Iranian nation is standing for its cause, and that is the full annihilation of Israel. This is what the Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the regime, said 25 years ago. He said, one of our major points is that Israel must be destroyed. And this is what Akbar Rafsanjani, the former president, whom I love, in media accounts is described as a moderate, by the way. This is what Rafsanjani said in 2001. He said, if one day the Islamic world is also equipped with weapons like those in Israel's possession now, then the imperialist strategy will have reached a standstill because the use of even one nuclear bomb inside Israel will destroy everything. However, it will only harm the Islamic world. It is not irrational to contemplate such an eventuality. Now, one of the points that I constantly find myself arguing on venues like the Fareed Zakaria show is whether Iranians are rational. Now, what do you mean by rational? Do you think that the rationality that prevails in San Diego or in London or in Amsterdam is the same as the rationality that prevails in Tehran or Bushehr or Qom? People operate from different assumptions. People are willing to pay very different prices in pursuit of very different goals. And we actually dishonor the Iranians by not taking them at their word. They are doing us, as Ross said, a favor. They are blowing the shofar. They are telling us exactly what they intend to do. And it is only us in the West who are saying, that's not a warning that's being sounded. That's noise. Those are words. We need a kind of clarity about what the stakes are when we look at Iran's acquisition of nuclear weapons. Now, the next point I wanted to talk about is courage. We are now, I've been giving speeches about Iran for years. It's not halftime. It's crunch time. We are now at the point where Iran will either be allowed, because we are indecisive, or because we have other priorities, or because there's an election on and that can't get it, and we can't allow the rest of the world to get in the way. We are at the point in which Iran is either going to tiptoe across the nuclear line, or it's going to be stopped. Now, when I say, or it's going to be stopped, I don't mean to suggest that this is an option, either for the United States, much less for Israel, that is going to be a simple option. Does the AV have the pictures that I wanted back there? Do the audiovisual people have the screenshots? Oh, good. What are you looking at here? If you answer Masada, you're mistaken. This is the mountain in which the Fordow nuclear enrichment facility is buried. That's what you're looking at there, that mountain. That is one of at least a dozen sites that would need to be destroyed in the event of an attack, whether by Israel or by the United States. Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide? Right. What you're looking at here, I think that's an American F-15, but they're identical or roughly identical to the Israeli F-15s, is an F-15 fighter plane dropping an F-15 fighter dropping what's called a GBU-28, which is a 5,000-pound bunker-busting bomb. These things are very big. They are the largest bunker busters in Israel's arsenal. Next slide, please. Now, you have a B-50U dropping what's known as a massive ordnance penetrator, the largest bunker buster in the American arsenal. And there's an F-16, I think, in the background, which gives you a sense of the comparative size. I wanted you to see this, to understand, first of all, the task at hand, and second of all, the difference in capability between what Israel is able to field and what the United States is able to field. Nonetheless, whether Israel or the United States undertakes an attack against Iran, there will be consequences, and those consequences will frighten us. If Israel attacks Iran, don't expect it to look like the attack on Osirak. You wake up, you read in the newspaper that yesterday the Israelis attacked. If Israel attacks Iran, it will be the beginning of another Yom Kippur war. Hundreds and thousands of Israelis may be killed in Iranian missile strikes. Hezbollah will be activated. The north of the country is going to be going into bunkers. The Israeli army might have to invade both Gaza and southern Lebanon. If Israel attacks, it will be faced with one of the greatest crises, militarily speaking, in its history. It is not a simple operation. And even if the United States attacks, we will run risks to our assets, to our people, to our servicemen in the Persian Gulf and throughout the world. Remember, this is a regime that was prepared to blow up a restaurant in Washington, D.C. just to kill the Saudi ambassador and whoever else happened to be dining there. This is a regime that takes risks. This is a snake of a regime coiled and waiting to strike. So people need to be mindful now of what Israel, what the United States might face. In 1967, on the 4th of June, the Israeli cabinet met to decide whether it would go to war and strike its enemies preemptively or not. When that cabinet met, this is what they knew. They knew that the Egyptians had moved hundreds of thousands of soldiers into the Sinai after evicting UN inspectors or UN so-called peacekeepers. They knew that Egypt, Iraq, and Jordan had signed a, quote, mutual defense treaty. They knew that the Egyptians had closed the Strait of Tiran, which is an act of war. They knew that despite promises from a president at the time who billed himself the best friend that Israel had ever had in the White House, offers of military aid had not come through. Israel was not being armed by the United States government. They knew that the government of France, its former ally, had decided to impose an arms embargo on them before they had even struck a blow. They knew from their ambassador in Moscow that Audrey, who, as you remember, was then the Soviet foreign minister, had said, "If you strike, we will support our Arab friends." Prime Minister Levi Eshkol had received a long telegram from President Johnson saying, Israel will not be alone unless it goes it alone. They knew that an effort to mount an international armada to unblock the Straits of Tiran had gone nowhere. At that meeting, one cabinet minister said, "Do not go to war alone. Do not go to war without the United States as an ally, because that is as much a strategic asset to us as anything else." Another cabinet minister said, "Do not go to war without a clear cause of war, a clear casus belli. Send a cargo ship through the Straits of Tiran and let the Egyptians fire on it, even if it means the loss of our sailors." They knew that David Ben-Gurion, the founder of the state, he was no longer prime minister, he was living in Sde Boker, but he was still one of the most influential men in Israel, said, "Isn't this premature? Aren't we risking everything?" On June 4th, 1967, Israel did not know that in 24 hours it would destroy the entire air force of Egypt and Syria and Jordan and be on its way to the single greatest military victory of the 20th century. They did not know that. At that meeting, Yigal Allon, who was then Israel's labor minister, said something that I thought was prophetic. He said, "They," meaning the international community, "will condemn us, and we will survive." That is courage. That is what Israel was able to do the last time it faced a crucible of the kind that it faces today with the advent of a nuclear war. I just want to make a final point, and it's about friendship. This is an organization called Stand With Us. It's effectively devoted to friendship. Everybody wants to be Israel's friend, and everybody says there are a million ways to be Israel's friend. And it's true, there are a million ways to be Israel's friend. But there are also a million ways to be Israel's false friend, phony friend, fair weather friend. There are a lot of politicians all throughout Europe proclaiming their indignation that Ahmadinejad is calling for Israel to be wiped off the map, and these things never cease. And yet you don't find a single government in Europe actually lifting a finger, except maybe the Germans, lifting a finger for the state of Israel. Not one. No sense of historical memory, no sense of the Holocaust. A lot of excuses, both internal and purportedly moral, about why they won't help. You find a lot of people in the United States, I'm sad to say also in the Jewish community, who say, "Oh, there is no greater Zionist than me." But Israel must, before anything, renounce the settlements, return to its 1967 borders, make good faith efforts towards peace with its neighbors, and basically check off a long list of demands on their part before they feel that Israel is a friend whom they are morally comfortable having. Israel has mountains, lines of phony friends, and that line is growing much longer. I suspect that all of you, whether you're liberals or conservatives, Republicans, Democrats, Jews, Christians, whatever, you're here because you intend to be a real friend of the state of Israel, and a real friend is someone who makes himself counted at moments when it counts. Historically, this is that moment. This is why you're here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bret Stephens. Thank you, Bret. Now, we only have time for 3 to 4 questions. The ushers, if they could raise their hands, if you could write down the questions, and then they'll bring them up to the front. In the meantime, I'll just begin with one question for Bret, which is, as if you hand them to the ushers, then they'll bring them forwards. Bret, you mentioned about how we should be telling ourselves a truthful narrative and stop being deceitful about what's going on. And I just wondered what the balance is. Often, the Jewish mentality can be one of a victim mentality. Passover, they tried to kill us. On Pesach, Purim, they tried to kill us. Where is the balance? And what should the narrative be that we tell ourselves?
It's a very interesting question, because a great deal of what goes on, for reasons which I think are very understandable and in some ways admirable, are devoted to thinking about Israel through a victimhood narrative. Now, Israel is, in fact, the victim of terrorism, is, in fact, the victim of an international system which finds, which condemns it constantly, and could be, in fact, within our lifetime, the victim of a genocidal act by the rulers of Iran. But the reason to sympathize with Israel is not because it's the victim or because it's the underdog, it's because it's right. That is an important distinction. One of the reasons why the Palestinians have garnered so much international affection is because there is this fetish in the West for always siding with the underdog. Now, if some of you here are fans of the Boston Red Sox, okay, that's fine if you want to side with a perpetual loser. But that's not the way in which we ought to be making moral judgments. Israel was not founded to perpetuate Jewish victimhood. Israel was founded to end Jewish victimhood. And we do ourselves a disservice, frankly, when we spend a lot of time talking about Sderot as the de facto capital of Israel. The people of Sderot are brave, and they've endured more than any other town ought to endure. But Sderot is an emblem of Israeli failure, not Israeli success. Israeli success comes when you put an end to the shelling and rocketing of Sderot.
Thank you. Second question, won't an attack on Iran, if it's successful, merely by a few years, and what is the good in that?
Wonderful question. When Israel attacked the Osirak reactor in 1981, the best estimate is that it would delay Iraq's nuclear program by a few years. Now, delay, in life, delay is everything, okay? At some point you will die, you can only postpone it for so long, but you'd like to delay that moment, you know, a few years more. The question is, what virtuous things, what might happen when you have a delay? Let me tell you a story. I had an opportunity not long ago to have a conversation with a senior, how shall I put this? He was a diplomat from a non-Western, but nonetheless pro-Western Asian country who had been stationed in Tehran as ambassador for a number of years. And, you know, he was a very intelligent, discerning guy. I said to him, what would happen if Israel or the United States attacked and destroyed Iran's nuclear facilities? And I was stunned by his answer. He said the regime would collapse. I said, what do you mean? He said they have invested all of their prestige into this program, billions of dollars into this program. They have been thumbing their nose at the West for the sake of this program. And to watch it go up in smoke and ashes isn't going to rally Iranians around a regime they already detest. It's going to make the Iranian people understand that their masters are also weak. Now that's an important insight. You know, in 1982, a horrible regime called the Galtieri regime in Argentina, was busy massacring all kinds of people, invaded the Falklands, or Las Malvinas, as they call them. Nationalist cause. Suddenly there was this upsurge in support for the regime. This woman with a handbag said, sent down an armada. The Falklands were restored to British rule. And within a week, the military junta in Argentina fell and democracy was restored to Argentina. It's a similar thing that's going on now. Now, you're absolutely right. Are there unknowables to any kind of strike? You can only delay it 2, 3, 4 years. You don't know that. But just because all statesmen and all military operations operate in a fog of uncertainty is not a prescription for inaction. It shouldn't paralyze us knowing that we are operating in circumstances where outcomes aren't certain. Many of you are in business in this audience. You don't operate with a perfect certainty about what tax rates are going to be next year. Is there going to be a recession next year? What new regulations Jerry Brown is going to impose on your business? Whatever. You don't know. Or remove from your business. I don't know. I don't talk about California politics. That's not life. And that's certainly not the life and death of nations. The motto of Israel's commandos, and actually of your own SAS as well, is who dares wins. And right now, Iran is doing all the daring.
Thank you. I'll group the next two questions together. First one, if Israel acts unilaterally in attacking Iran, what do you think Obama will do? And I'll group the other question with that, which is, what do you think this means for the future of the Democratic Party and the bipartisan support that it currently receives?
As an Israeli sage once said in answer to your first question, it's depend. Look, I don't know what Obama's going to do. I'm not clairvoyant. This is what I would expect the president to do, given the messages he's offered of the affirmations of strong U.S. support, which is to understand that Israel is faced with the prospect of a regime that pledges the genocide of the Jewish people and is rapidly moving towards acquiring the means to carry out that genocide, and that irrespective of whether it's Israel or any other country, this administration, because it is liberal, because it is democratic, because it is humane, does not stand by situations in which a country faces this kind of risk. So without offering forecasts which are effectively meaningless, I would say that. I would say this too, for reasons which are totally beyond me. The people who typically in the political debate are arguing against military action on Iran are people from the left side of the political spectrum. Now, this makes no sense to me, okay? Iran is a country that stones women to death. Iran is a country that hangs gays and lesbians. Iran is a country in which a woman is legally worth half as much as a man is. Now, I would say that a country that is prepared to take in its left hand a stone and murder a defenseless woman buried in the dirt up to her waist should not be given a nuclear weapon in its right hand to lob against Israel or anyone else. Just one more point on that. You know, people say, okay, I'm from the Wall Street Journal's editorial page, so I'm this crazy right-winger. I may be crazy, but I'm much less right-wing on many issues as some people may imagine. People say, you know, I often get the question, why aren't Jews voting Republican and so on? And I say, I'm happy Jews are voting Democratic. A, it's a free country. B, American Jews don't need to vote on one single issue. And C, the Democratic Party has historically been and must remain as powerfully committed to Israel's security as the Republicans have become in recent years. It didn't used to be the case, by the way. It is the job, I think, of Democratic politicians today to stand up against people who present themselves as liberals but are really the fan club of totalitarians and say, no, we stand by Israel because it is a liberal, tolerant, progressive, free society where the values in which we most believe in are freely expressed. We stand by Israel for all the good liberal reasons, not for some conservative reason. That needs to remain a pillar of liberal life. You know, every party the Republicans have crazy fringes, and yes, the Democrats have crazy fringes. And part of that left-wing crazy fringe is saying, oh, Israel's this apartheid state. No, Israel's not an apartheid state. Israel is the only non-apartheid state, only liberal state in the entire region.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. So we've got time for one last question. We can't go on much longer. We don't want to start a riot here. After all, it's a room full of Jews and no one's eaten for nearly an hour. You mentioned that despots smell weakness. Is a viable strategy to kill the Ayatollah and Ahmadinejad, take out the Iranian leadership instead of bombing the nuclear facilities?
Ultimately, the Iranian nuclear problem will never be fully resolved until this regime is out of power. And there are essentially, just to think about it this way, there is this clock on one side, it's called the nuclear clock, and it's ticking at about, I don't know, 11:45 p.m. And there's this clock on the other side, which is the democracy clock, the green revolution clock, but unfortunately it's been set back to about 11 o'clock in the morning. We need to find a way in which we can sufficiently set back the nuclear clock and move forward the democracy clock so that at one point the Iranian people will be able to determine what a just future is for a Mr. Ahmadinejad and a Mr. Khamenei and everyone else who are busy torturing very courageous Iranian dissidents and people in the dungeons of Evin prison. And let us not forget, you know, in the 1980s, everyone knew the name of Sakharov, everyone knew the name of Sharansky. Do we know the names of the Iranians who are in their prisons today? Let's make this our business to find out who they are. Let's write petitions. Let's have meetings on campus to talk about some extraordinarily brave young men and women, the Neda Sultans, who are out there, who are risking their lives and who are being tortured by the Iranian regime because they simply want to live in a free and tolerant society. We owe them our bond. By all means, we have to stand with Israel. Standing with Israel also means remembering that there are people in the Muslim world today who are also standing up for freedom and whose ultimate freedom is the ultimate security of the State of Israel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Bret Stephens.